I'm tired of anybody that gets new boots and a compass thinking they're a hiker. Happens every year, doesn't it? Two people go out, new boots, compass, and they get lost. Then they have to send 100 people out to find them. Then 10 of those poor bastards get lost. They gotta send 1,000 poor bastards out to get them. Pretty soon, 10,000 people are looking for two with new boots and a compass.
Good morning. It's Tuesday, Ayn Rand Tuesday, December the 12th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have the military shorts, Bishop Barron, the 33 strategies of war, and Ayn Rand's book, Philosophy Who Needs It. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I shouldn't change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Thank you. And now, the military shorts.
We have our counterparts in the Navy, the Blue Angels. We tried to get together once a year with those guys. Funny thing happened in 1976, and we were there, and the Blues said, hey, would you guys like to go out in a carrier and watch carrier operations? And we said, yeah, we would like to do that. They said, okay, well, we've got to do some administrative work before you can do that, and one of them is you have to watch this training film. Great, we'll do that. Well, the training film was 30 minutes of carrier accidents. Airplanes crashing the carrier. So they said, okay, you're done. Let's go get in the airplane and go to the ship. We were all, butta. So anyway, we went out and we trapped on the boat, on the ship, spent the day on the Lexington, and then catapulted off in the afternoon. So I am an honorary tail hooker. And of course, the Blues didn't go with us. They sent us out there by ourselves. And we got back on shore and they were giggling and chuckling. Well, how was the day? How'd you like the landing? It was great. So we had a great relationship with those guys.
The U.S.'s new sixth-generation fighter jet is finally here. It should be ready for World War III. This is the F/A-XX. This new aircraft is the future of air superiority and has a range of features that make it different. With its open, sleek design, the F/A-XX allows for different sensors, payloads, and weapons depending on the mission. But its arsenal is crazy. The fighter is made to hold and use directed energy weapons. It will be fearless, as it can fly either manned or on its own. It's fueled by two General Electric XA-100 engines, each with a maximum thrust of 45,000 pounds. The F/A-XX uses never-seen-before heat-resistant materials, which means the engines can work best at higher temperatures. However, to make things so much better, the fighter has sensors and electronics built into its body. This not only improves sensor performance, but also reduces drag, taking its speed and maneuverability to the next level. But this is part of the United States UNGAD program.
The USS America has a displacement of approximately 45,000 tons and measures about 844 feet in length. It features a large flight deck, similar to that of an aircraft carrier, which can accommodate a wide range of aircraft. The ship is specifically optimized to support the operations of the F-35B Lightning II, a fifth-generation stealth fighter capable of short takeoffs and vertical landings. Unlike traditional aircraft carriers, the USS America does not have a good deck for launching and recovering landing craft. Instead, it has increased aviation facilities and storage capacity to support a larger number of aircraft and their associated equipment. It can carry a mix of helicopters, tilt-rotor aircraft, such as the MV-22 Osprey, and fixed-wing aircraft. So, is the USS America an aircraft carrier? Yes, the USS America is an aircraft carrier. It is the lead ship of the American class of amphibious assault ships in the United States Navy.
What if Napoleon won the Battle of Waterloo? If Napoleon had won, he would have been able to continue ruling France. However, by that point, France was too depleted in terms of manpower to continue fighting large wars. So Napoleon would probably have signed a peace agreement restoring the independence of French vassals like Prussia and Austria. The French Empire would have shrunk a bit, but it would have survived.
He grew up so poor that the first time he ate 3 meals in one day was when he was drafted by the Army Air Force in 1943. He was a nose gunner on a B-29 Superfortress, where he would fly 25 missions throughout 1945, most of them over the Japanese mainland and surrounding islands. His name was Corporal Charles Dennis Bukinski, and it was during a bombing run over the critical Hodogaya chemical plant where he was riddled with machine gun fire as the bomber approached the target. Bleeding profusely, Bukinski refused aid as he remained at his gun and fought off an onslaught of fighters until they returned safely, earning a Purple Heart. The world would come to know him as Charles Bronson, one of Hollywood's most bankable tough guy leading men, whose breakthrough role came in The Great Escape. Bronson's gravesite speaks nothing of his acting career, just that he served his country, concluding with, "Do not stand at my grave and cry, I am not here, I did not die."
The Kirov-class battlecruiser, also known as Sea Eagle, is a class of nuclear-powered guided missile warships built for the Soviet Navy and currently serving in the Russian Navy. The Kirov class was designed and developed in the late 1970s and early 1980s as part of the Soviet Navy's response to the U.S. Navy. The Kirov-class battlecruisers are massive ships, measuring over 800 feet long and displacing over 28,000 tons at full load. They are powered by 2 nuclear reactors, which give them a range of over 10,000 nautical miles. Their main armament consists of 20 P-700 Granite anti-ship missiles, which have a range of over 300 miles. They also carry a variety of other weapons, including surface-to-air missiles, anti-submarine missiles, and guns. The Kirov-class battlecruisers are powerful warships that have had a significant impact on the balance of naval power. Their size, firepower, and nuclear propulsion make them a formidable force at sea.
Why is Israel not sending weapons to Ukraine? On the surface, it seems like it should be a slam dunk. Ukraine is the only other country in the world with a Jewish leader, and Israel is far closer to the United States and NATO than they are to Russia. Israel also knows what it's like to be on the opposite side of a much more powerful enemy invasion from its independence war in 1948. Despite this, Israel has only given Ukraine humanitarian aid and helped to resettle refugees. Under former Prime Minister Yair Lapid, the primary concern was likely Russia's presence in Syria. Russia is largely the reason why President Bashar al-Assad is still in power, and he still could easily unleash proxies to attack Israel if he feels crossed. But the return of arch-right Prime Minister Netanyahu complicates things. Netanyahu had tense relations with President Biden's Democratic predecessor Barack Obama and is even more skeptical of aiding Ukraine than Lapid was, which means that Israel is likely to stay on the sidelines, and given the massive protests filling the streets of Israel, it might have its own concerns to deal with.
The Astute and Virginia are both nuclear-powered attack submarines currently in operation. The Astute class is smaller and more maneuverable with a displacement of 7,000 tons submerged and a crew of 90. It is powered by a Rolls-Royce PWR-2 reactor and has a speed of 30 knots submerged. Its armament includes 38 Spearfish torpedo tubes and Tomahawk cruise missiles. The Virginia class is larger and has a larger payload capacity, with a displacement of 10,000 tons submerged and a crew of 130. It is powered by an S-9G reactor and has a speed of 25 knots submerged. Its armament includes 25 torpedo tubes and Tomahawk cruise missiles. Both submarines are equipped with advanced sonar systems and other sensors. Astute and the Virginia are powerful and capable vessels, and the best choice will depend on the specific needs and priorities of the operating Navy.
It should have been an impossible landing. After a deceptively clear day out at sea turned into a hazy downpour, an F-14 pilot was suddenly caught in a life-or-death situation as he came in to land on the USS Enterprise. You see, carrier landings are notoriously difficult even on a good day, but as this particular F-14 approached the carrier, a film of water spraying against the windshield made it impossible to see anything. Trying to calm himself, he listened to the RIO and landing signal officer while trying his best not to overcompensate out of fear. But he was now flying blind and trying to land on a ship that was pitching and rolling from the rough swells. In fact, he knew that anything less than perfect could end in a fatal crash. So as he sensed the vague gray form of the carrier beneath him, he focused on the controls and somehow managed to come in perfectly on speed, on glide slope, and on center line. Only after stopping did he realize he had just landed blind in the middle of a thunderstorm. Between April 29th and 30th, 1975, thousands of American and South Vietnamese civilians were evacuated from Saigon as the North Vietnamese closed in. Many were picked up by helicopter, but thousands more fled on whatever they could find. It was during this desperate last-minute evacuation that a Cessna 01 flew over the USS Midway and dropped a pistol with a note wrapped around it. The note read, "Can you move these helicopter to the other side? I can land on your runway. I can fly 1 hour more. We have enough time to move. Please rescue me. Major Buang, wife and 5 child." Without hesitating, the carrier's commander ordered several UH-1 Huey helicopters to be pushed into the sea. But the problem was, the Cessna was not equipped with a tailhook, and everyone held their breath as it approached the deck in a strong crosswind. After landing safely, Major Buang and his entire family climbed out as the sailors cheered. The commander was sure he'd be court-martialed for the $10 million loss, but no one was ever prosecuted.
Hamas.
And that was the 10 military shorts. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
Each individual person is a subject of infinite dignity, but not the creator of value. See, I think everybody, that is supremely dangerous talk. When we say that the sovereign self invents value, we are on a very short road to a moral chaos. Rather, we would say at the heart of our social theory ought to be love. What's love? Not a feeling. Love is an act of the will. It's to will the good of the other. If I'm inventing value, I got my value, you got your value, and let's just vaguely tolerate each other, then we can't love each other. Because love has to display itself, as it were, against the background of a hierarchy of objective value. Otherwise, I don't know what I should will for you.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Ronald Reagan.
If we look to the answer as to why for so many years we achieved so much, prospered as no other people on earth, it was because here in this land we unleashed the energy and individual genius of man to a greater extent than has ever been done before. Freedom and the dignity of the individual have been more available and assured here than in any other place on earth. The price for this freedom at times has been high, but we have never been unwilling to pay that price. Those who say that we're in a time when there are no heroes, they just don't know where to look. The sloping hills of Arlington National Cemetery, with its row upon row of simple white markers bearing crosses or stars of David, they add up to only a tiny fraction of the price that has been paid for our freedom. Each one of those markers is a monument to the kind of hero I spoke of earlier. Their lives ended in places called Belleau Wood, the Argonne, Omaha Beach, Salerno, and halfway around the world on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Pork Chop Hill, the Chosin Reservoir, and in 100 rice paddies and jungles of a place called Vietnam. Under one such marker lies a young man, Martin Treptow, who left his job in a small-town barber shop in 1917 to go to France with the famed Rainbow Division. There on the Western Front, he was killed trying to carry a message between battalions under heavy artillery fire. We're told that on his body was found a diary. On the flyleaf, under the heading, My Pledge, he had written these words: America must win this war. Therefore I will work, I will save, I will sacrifice, I will endure. I will fight cheerfully and do my utmost as if the issue of the whole struggle depended on me alone. We must realize that no arsenal or no weapon in the arsenals of the world is so formidable as the will and moral courage of free men and women. It is a weapon our adversaries in today's world do not have. It is a weapon that we as Americans do have. Let that be understood by those who practice terrorism and prey upon their neighbors. As for the enemies of freedom, those who are potential adversaries, they will be reminded that peace is the highest aspiration of the American people. We will negotiate for it, sacrifice for it. We will not surrender for it now or ever. We are Americans.
Thank you. Now, Chapter 3, the beginning of Chapter 3 of the 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene.
Chapter 3. Amidst the turmoil of events, do not lose your presence of mind. The counterbalance strategy. In the heat of battle, the mind tends to lose its balance. Too many things confront you at the same time. Unexpected setbacks, doubts, and criticisms from your own allies. There's a danger of responding emotionally, with fear, depression, or frustration. It is vital to keep your presence of mind, maintaining your mental powers whatever the circumstances. You must actively resist the emotional pull of the moment, staying decisive, confident, and aggressive no matter what hits you. Make the mind tougher by exposing it to adversity. Learn to detach yourself from the chaos of the battlefield. Let others lose their heads. Your presence of mind will steer you clear of their influence and keep you on course. The hyper-aggressive tactic. Vice Admiral Lord Horatio Nelson, 1758 to 1805, had been through it all. He had lost his right eye in the siege of Calvi and his right arm in the Battle of Tenerife. He had defeated the Spanish at Cape St. Vincent in 1797 and had thwarted Napoleon's Egyptian campaign by defeating his navy at the Battle of the Nile the following year. But none of his tribulations and triumphs prepared him for the problems he faced from his own colleagues in the British Navy as they prepared to go to war against Denmark in February 1801. Nelson, England's most glorious war hero, was the obvious choice to lead the fleet. Instead, the Admiralty chose Sir Hyde Parker, with Nelson his second in command. This war was a delicate business. It was intended to force the disobedient Danes to comply with a British-led embargo on the shipping of military goods to France. The fiery Nelson was prone to lose his cool. He hated Napoleon, and if he went too far against the Danes, he would produce a diplomatic fiasco. Sir Hyde was an older, more stable, even-tempered man who would do the job and nothing more. Nelson swallowed his pride and took the assignment, but he saw trouble ahead. He knew that time was of the essence. The faster the Navy sailed, the less chance the Danes would have to build up their defenses. The ships were ready to sail, but Parker's motto was, "Everything in good order." It wasn't his style to hurry. Nelson hated his casualness and burned for action. He reviewed intelligence reports, studied maps, and came up with a detailed plan for fighting the Danes. He wrote to Parker, urging him to seize the initiative. Parker ignored him. At last, on March 11th, the British fleet set sail. Instead of heading for Copenhagen, however, Parker anchored well to the north of the city's harbor and called a meeting of his captains. According to intelligence reports, he explained, the Danes had prepared elaborate defenses for Copenhagen. Boats anchored in the harbor, forts to the north and south, and mobile artillery batteries could blast the British out of the water. How to fight this artillery without terrible losses? Also, pilots who knew the waters around Copenhagen reported that they were treacherous, places of sandbars and tricky winds. Navigating these dangers under bombardment would be harrowing. With all of these difficulties, perhaps it was best to wait for the Danes to leave harbor and then fight them in open sea. Nelson struggled to control himself. Finally, he let loose, pacing the room, the stub of his lost arm jerking as he spoke. No war, he said, had ever been won by waiting. The Danish defenses looked formidable to those who are children at war, but he had worked out a strategy weeks earlier. He would attack from the south, the easier approach, while Parker and a reserve force would stay to the city's north. Nelson would use his mobility to take out the Danish guns. He had studied the maps. Sandbars were no threat. As for the wind, aggressive action was more important than fretting over wind. Nelson's speech energized Parker's captains. He was by far their most successful leader, and his confidence was catching. Even Sir Hyde was impressed, and the plan was approved. The next morning, Nelson's line of ships advanced on Copenhagen, and the battle began. The Danish guns, firing on the British at close range, took a fierce toll. Nelson paced the deck of his flagship, HMS Elephant, urging his men on. He was in an excited, almost ecstatic state. A shot through the mainmast nearly hit him. "It is a warm work, and this day may be the last to any of us at any moment," he told a colonel, a little shaken up by the blast. "But mark you, I would not be elsewhere for thousands." Parker followed the battle from his position to the north. He now regretted agreeing to Nelson's plan. He was responsible for the campaign, and a defeat here could ruin his career. After 4 hours of back-and-forth bombardment, he had seen enough. The fleet had taken a beating and had gained no advantage. Nelson never knew when to quit. Parker decided it was time to hoist the signal flag 39, the order to withdraw. The first ships to see it were to acknowledge it and pass the signal on down the line. Once acknowledged, there was nothing else to do but retreat. The battle was over. On board the Elephant, a lieutenant told Nelson about the signal. The vice admiral ignored it. Continuing to pound the Danish defenses, he eventually called to an officer, "Is number 16 still hoisted?" Number 16 was his own flag. It meant engage the enemy more closely. The officer confirmed that the flag was still flying. "Mind you keep it so," Nelson told him. A few minutes later, Parker's signal still flapping in the breeze, Nelson turned to his flag captain. "You know, Foley, I have only one eye. I have a right to be blind sometimes." And raising his telescope to his blind eye, he calmly remarked, "I really do not see the signal." Torn between obeying Parker and obeying Nelson, the fleet captains chose Nelson. They would risk their careers along with his. But soon the Danish defenses started to crack. Some of the ships anchored in the harbor surrendered, and the firing of the guns began to slow. Less than an hour after Parker's signal to stop the battle, the Danes surrendered. The next day, Parker perfunctorily congratulated Nelson on the victory. He did not mention his subordinate's disobedience. He was hoping the whole affair, including his own lack of courage, would be quietly forgotten. Interpretation. When the Admiralty put its faith in Sir Hyde, it made a classical military error. It entrusted the waging of a war to a man who was careful and methodical. Such men may seem calm, even strong in times of peace, but their self-control often hides weakness. The reason they think things through so carefully is that they are terrified of making a mistake, and of what that might mean for them in their career. This doesn't come out until they are tested in battle. Suddenly, they cannot make a decision. They see problems everywhere and defeat in the smallest setback. They hang back not out of patience, but out of fear. Often, these moments of hesitation spell their doom. Lord Nelson operated according to the opposite principle. Slight of build, with a delicate constitution, he compensated for his physical weakness with fierce determination. He forced himself to be more resolute than anyone around him. The moment he entered battle, he ratcheted up his aggressive impulses. Where other sea lords worried about casualties, the wind, changes in the enemy's formation, he concentrated on his plan. Before battle, no one strategized or studied his opponents more thoroughly. That knowledge helped Nelson to sense when the enemy was ready to crumble. But once the engagement began, hesitation and carefulness were dropped. Presence of mind is a kind of counterbalance to mental weakness, to our tendency to get emotional and lose perspective in the heat of battle. Our greatest weakness is losing heart, doubting ourselves, becoming unnecessarily cautious. Being more careful is not what we need. That is just a screen for our fear of conflict and of making a mistake. What we need is double the resolve, an intensification of confidence. That will serve as a counterbalance. In moments of turmoil and trouble, you must force yourself to be more determined. Call up the aggressive energy you need to overcome caution and inertia. Any mistakes you make, you can rectify with more energetic action still. Save your carefulness for the hours of preparation. But once the fighting begins, empty your mind of doubts. Ignore those who quail at any setback and call for retreat. Find joy in attack mode. Momentum will carry you through.
And that was part 1 of Chapter 3, Amidst the Turmoil of Events, from The 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Chapter 16, or at least the first part of Chapter 16, from Ayn Rand's book, Philosophy, Who Needs It?
16. Fairness Doctrine for Education, 1972. The Fairness Doctrine is a messy little makeshift of the mixed economy and a poor substitute for freedom of speech. It has, however, served as a minimal retarder of the collectivist trend. It has prevented the establishment's total takeover of the airwaves. For this reason, as a temporary measure in a grave national emergency, the fairness doctrine should now be invoked in behalf of education. The doctrine is a typical product of the socialist sentimentality that dreams of combining government ownership with intellectual freedom. As applied to television and radio broadcasting, the fairness doctrine demands that equal opportunity be given to all sides of a controversial issue, on the grounds of the notion that the people owns the airwaves, and therefore all factions of the people should have equal access to their communal property. The trouble with the fairness doctrine is that it cannot be applied fairly. Like any ideological product of a mixed economy, it is a vague, indefinable approximation, and therefore an instrument of pressure group warfare. Who determines which issues are controversial? Who chooses the representatives of the different sides in a given controversy? If there are many conflicting viewpoints, which are to be given a voice and which are to be kept silent? Who is the people and who is not? It is clear that the individual's views are barred altogether, and that the fairness is extended only to groups. The formula employed by the television stations in New York declares that they recognize their obligation to provide equal time to significant opposing viewpoints. Who determines which viewpoint is significant? Is the standard qualitative or quantitative? It is obviously this last, as one may observe in practice. Whenever an answer is given to a TV editorial, it is given by a representative of some group involved in the debated subject. The fairness doctrine, as well as the myth of public ownership, is based on the favorite illusion of the mushy socialists, i.e., those who want to combine force and freedom, as distinguished from the bloody socialists, i.e., the communists and the fascists. That illusion is the belief that the people, the masses, would be essentially unanimous, that dissenting groups would be rare and easily accommodated, that a monolithic majority will would prevail, and that any injustice done would be done only to recalcitrant individuals, who, in a socialist theory, do not count anyway. For discussion of why the airwaves should be private property, see The Property Status of Airwaves in my book Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. In practice, the fairness doctrine has led to the precarious rule of a centrist attitude, of timidity, compromise, and fear, with the center slithering slowly, inexorably to the left, i.e., controlled by the establishment, limited only by the remnants of a tradition of freedom, by lip service to impartiality, by fear of being caught at too obvious an unfairness, and by the practice of window dressing, which consists in some occasional moments of airtime tossed to some representatives of extreme and actually significant opposing viewpoints. Such a policy, by its very nature, is temporary. Nevertheless, this window dressing is the last chance that the advocates of freedom have as far as the airwaves are concerned. There is no equivalent of the fairness doctrine in the field which is much more important to a nation's future than its airwaves, the field which determines a country's intellectual trends, i.e., the dominant ideas in people's minds, in the culture, in the establishment, in the press, and ultimately, on the air. The field of higher education. So long as higher education is provided predominantly by private colleges and universities, no problem of unfairness existed. A private school has the right to teach any ideas of its owner's choice and to exclude all opposing ideas, but it has no power to force such exclusion on the rest of the country. The opponents have the right to establish schools of their own and to teach their ideas or a wider spectrum of viewpoints if they so choose. The competition of the free marketplace of ideas does the rest, determining every school's success or failure, which, historically, was the course of the development of the great private universities. But the growth of government power, of state universities, and of taxation brought the private universities under a growing control by and dependence on the government. On this point, see also tax credits for education in the Ayn Rand letter of March 13, 1972. The current bill providing federal aid to higher education will make the control and dependence all but total, thus establishing a government monopoly on all education. The most ominously crucial question now hanging over this country's future is, what will our universities teach at our expense and without our consent? What ideas will be propagated or excluded? This question applies to all public and semi-public institutions of learning. By semi-public, I mean those formerly private institutions, which are to be supported in part by public funds and controlled in full by the government. The government has no right to set itself up as the arbiter of ideas, and therefore its establishments, the public and semi-public schools, have no right to teach a single viewpoint, excluding all others. They have no right to serve the beliefs of any one group of citizens, leaving others ignored and silenced. They have no right to impose inequality on the citizens who bear equally the burden of supporting them. As in the case of governmental grants to science, it is viciously wrong to force an individual to pay for the teaching of ideas diametrically opposed to his own. It is a profound violation of his rights. The violation becomes monstrous if his ideas are excluded from such public teaching, and this means that he is forced to pay for the propagation of that which he regards as false and evil, and for the suppression of that which he regards as true and good. If there is a viler form of injustice, I challenge any resident of Washington, D.C. to name it. Yet this is the form of injustice committed by the present policy of an overwhelming majority of our public and semi-public universities. There is a widespread impression that television and the press are biased and slanted to the left, but they are models of impartiality and fairness compared to the ferocious intolerance, the bias, the prejudices, the distortions, the savage obscurantism now running riot in most of our institutions of higher learning, in regard to matters deeper than mere politics. With rare exceptions, each of the various departments and disciplines is ruled by its own particular clique that gets in and virtually excludes the teaching of any theory or viewpoint other than its own. If a private school permits this, it has the right to do so. A public or semi-public school has not. Controversy is the hallmark of our age. There is no subject, particularly in the humanities, which is not regarded in fundamentally different ways by many different schools of thought. This is not to say that all of them are valid, but merely to observe that they exist. Yet most university departments, particularly in the leading universities, offer a single viewpoint, camouflaged by minor variations, and maintain their monopoly by the simple means of evasion, by ignoring anything that does not fit their viewpoint, by pretending that no others exist, and by reducing dissent to trivia, thus leaving fundamentals unchallenged. Most of today's philosophy departments are dominated by linguistic analysis, the unsuccessful product of crossbreeding between philosophy and grammar, a union whose offspring is less viable than a mule. With some remnants of its immediate progenitors, pragmatism and logical positivism still clinging to its bandwagon. The more broad-minded departments include an opposition, the other side of the same Kantian coin, existentialism. One side claims that philosophy is grammar, the other that philosophy is feelings. Psychology departments have a sprinkling of Freudians, but are dominated by behaviorism, whose leader is B.F. Skinner. Here the controversy is between the claim that man is moved by innate ideas and the claim that he has no ideas at all. Economics departments are dominated by Marxism, which is taken straight or on the rocks in the form of Keynesianism. What the political science departments and the business administration schools are dominated by is best illustrated by the following example. In a distinguished Ivy League university, a dean of the School of Business recently suggested that it be renamed School of Management, explaining that profit-making is unpopular with students and that most of them want to work for non-profit institutions, such as government or charities. Sociology departments are dominated by the fact that no one has ever defined what sociology is. English departments are dominated by the New York Times Book Review. I do not know the state of the various departments in the physical sciences, but we have seen an indication of it, the scientific writings of the ecologists. As a result of today's educational policies, the majority of college graduates are virtually illiterate, in the literal and the wider sense of the word. They do not necessarily accept their teachers' views, but they do not know that any other views exist or have ever existed. There are philosophy majors who graduate without having taken a single course on Aristotle, except as part of general surveys. There are economics majors who have no idea of what capitalism is or was, theoretically or historically, and not the faintest notion of the mechanism of a free market. There are literature majors who have never heard of Victor Hugo, but have acquired a full vocabulary of 4-letter words. So long as there are variations among university departments in the choice of their dominant prejudices, and so long as there were some distinguished survivors of an earlier, freer view of education, nonconformists had some chance. But with the spread of unpolarized unity and federal encouragement, the spread of the same gray, heavy-footed, deaf, dumb, and blind, hysterically stagnant dogma, that chance is vanishing. It is becoming increasingly harder for an independent mind to get or keep a job on a university faculty, or for the independent mind of a student to remain independent. This is the logical result of generations of post-Kantian statist philosophy, and of the vicious circle which it set up. As philosophy degenerates into irrationalism, it promotes the growth of government power, which, in turn, promotes the degeneration of philosophy. It is a paradox of our age of skepticism, with its proliferations of bromides to the effect that man can be certain of nothing. Reality is unknowable. There are no hard facts or hard knowledge. Everything is soft, except the point of a gun. That the overbearing dogmatism of university departments would make a medieval enforcer of religious dogma squirm with envy. It is a paradox, but not a contradiction, because it is the necessary consequence, the purpose of skepticism, which disarms its opponents by declaring, "How can you be sure?" and thus enables its leaders to propound absolutes at whim. It is this kind of intellectual atmosphere, and these types of cynical, bigoted, envy-ridden, decadent cliques that the federal government now proposes to support with public funds, and with the piously reiterated assurance that the profiteering institutions will retain their full freedom to teach whatever they please, that there will be no strings attached. Well, there is one string which all the opponents of the intellectual status quo now have the right to expect and demand: the fairness doctrine. If the public allegedly owns universities, as it allegedly owns the airwaves, then for all the same reasons, no specific ideology can be permitted to hold a monopoly in any department of any public or semi-public university. In all such institutions, every significant viewpoint must be given representation. By ideology, in this context, I mean a system of ideas derived from a theoretical base or frame of reference. The same considerations that led to the fairness doctrine in broadcasting apply to educational institutions, only more crucially, more urgently, more desperately so, because much more is involved than some ephemeral electronic sounds or images. because the mind of the young and the future of human knowledge are at stake. Would this doctrine work in regard to universities? Would it work as well and as badly as it has worked in broadcasting? It would work not as a motor of freedom, but as a brake on total regimentation. It would not achieve actual fairness, impartiality, or objectivity, but it would act as a temporary impediment to intellectual monopolies, a retarder of the establishment's takeover, a breach in the mental lethargy of the status quo, and occasionally, an opening for a brilliant dissenter who would know how to make it count. Remember that dissenters in today's academic world are not the advocates of mysticism, altruism, collectivism, who are the dominant cliques, the representatives of the entrenched status quo. The dissenters are the advocates of reason individualism, capitalism. If there are universities somewhere that bar the teaching of overtly vicious theories, such as communism, the advocates of these theories would be entitled to the protection of the fairness doctrine, so long as the university received government funds, because there are tax-paying citizens who are communists. The protection would apply to the right to teach ideas, not to criminal actions, such as campus riots or any form of physical violence. Since the fairness doctrine cannot be defined objectively, its application to specific cases would depend in large part on subjective interpretations, which would often be arbitrary and, at best, approximate. But there is no such approximation in the universities of Soviet Russia, as there was not in the universities of Nazi Germany. The purpose of the approximation is to preserve, to keep alive in men's minds, the principle of intellectual freedom, until the time when it can be implemented fully once more in free, i.e. private, universities. The main function of the fairness doctrine would be a switch of the burden of fear from the victim to the entrenched gang, and a switch of moral right from the entrenched gang to the victim. A dissenter would not have to be in the position of a martyr facing the power of a vast establishment with all the interlockings of unknowable cliques, with the mysterious lines of secret pull leading to omnipotent governmental authorities. He would have the protection of a recognized right. On the other hand, the establishment's hatchet men would have to be cautious, knowing that there is a limitation, at least in principle, on the irresponsible power granted by the use of public funds with no strings attached. But the fight for the fairness doctrine would require intellectual clarity, objectivity, and good, i.e., contextual judgment, because the elements to consider are extremely complex. For instance, the concept of equal time would not be entirely relevant. An hour in the class of an able professor can undo the harm done by a semester in the classes of the incompetent ones. And it would be impossible to burden the students with courses on every viewpoint in every subject. There is no precise way to determine which professor's viewpoints are the appropriate opposites of which, particularly in the midst of today's prevalent eclecticism. The policy of lip service to impartiality and of window dressing is practiced in many schools. And the eclecticism in some of the smaller colleges is such that no specific viewpoint can be discerned at all. It is the cases of extremes, of ideological unity on the faculty, and monopolistic monotony in teaching, particularly in the leading universities, which set the trends for all the rest, that require protest by an informed public opinion, by the dissenting faculty members, and by the main victims, the students. Intellectual diversity and ideological opposites can be determined only in terms of essentials. But it is an essential of modern philosophy to deny the existence or validity of essentials, which are called oversimplification.
And that's the first part of Chapter 16 of Ayn Rand's book, Philosophy, Who Needs It? Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to be honest, smart, and beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.